Welcome to the second installment in our understanding of the sixth step of Alcoholics Anonymous. And a reminder, the sixth step says we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. For our reflection in these next few minutes, I want to ask you to reflect on the spiritual principles of the sixth step. In part one of this series, I talked about the spiritual principle of willingness. In part two, I want to talk a little bit about the spiritual principle of courage and the spiritual understanding of surrender. All words that we're familiar with, all words that we see over and over again in the conference-approved literature of the program, all words that we've been using all of our lives. Willingness, courage, surrender. But in the context of sobriety, in the context of working the steps, in the context of understanding the traditions, they take on more spiritual meanings. And in our first session, I talked about the spirituality of willingness. I'll share with you what one of the old-timers have said about the sixth step. There are some of these defects of character that we don't want to get rid of because they might be interesting or fun. But when we come to AA, we don't have that prerogative. We are extremists. We go all the way or we don't go anyplace. Half measures get us nowhere. So, we are entirely ready to have God remove our defects of character. We can't remove them. God is going to remove them. We have turned our will and our lives over to God's care. Those are important realities of the self-help program. Those are important realities that in the old slogan, we came to, and we came to believe. And as our time in sobriety unfolds, we begin to see things in a more spiritual way, because that is the way to maintain sobriety. And when we understand that willingness is a spiritual posture, as I discussed in the first part of our series, we can begin to understand that courage and surrender are also spiritual postures. To have the courage to admit that the disease has taken control of your life, and to no longer deny that reality, argue about that, pretend that it doesn't exist, or otherwise act like it's not happening. That's courage. Courage to admit. But that courage is rooted in a spiritual posture of openness to the higher power, because most everyone doesn't have that courage in their egos. If they did, then it wouldn't be an issue, and they wouldn't be struggling with the disease. So the courage has to come from the higher power. Give me the courage to stop fighting against the truth. Give me the courage, please God, to no longer pretend that what's happening isn't really happening. Give me the courage to say, I need to live life differently, and I need to stop trying to live life according to what I think is right, because that's what got me into this mess that I'm in now. In order to have that courage, we need the higher power's grace. And for many people in the early part of their recovery process, that grace comes from being with others who are also trying to stay sober one day at a time. And so that courage comes from the group and from the spirit of the higher power that flows through the group, particularly for those who have time under their belts in sobriety. And so it's not the personal courage of a soldier on the battlefield, or the personal courage of someone who has to do something difficult. It's the spiritual courage of saying, I cried uncle. I can't do this anymore. And God, help me to be courageous and to live differently. And when we get to that moment where we say, I can't do this anymore, that's when surrender begins to creep into our awareness and our lives. And surrender is a spiritual principle and is rooted in step 6, because when I surrender to the truth, I claim the victory of sobriety. And it's a paradox. Most of us are formed in a mainstream culture that sees surrender as a weakness, as cowardly, as an admission of defeat. In addiction recovery, surrender becomes spiritually charged with greatness and filled with the grace and the reality that when I stop trying to pretend that what has happened has not happened, then I can begin to live in a different way, and that different way brings me back in connection with myself, with other people, and with higher power. And so in a paradoxical way, surrender becomes a great spiritual grace in all the lives of people in recovery. And so in step 6, when I adopt the posture of asking the higher power to remove my defects of character, I can't do that if I didn't have the courage from the higher power to say I need to live differently, and I didn't surrender to the truth that I can't figure this out by myself. So the surrender, the courage, and the willingness are all wrapped into one. They correlate with each other, and they operate in mysterious ways in our lives, but only if we keep trying, only if we work our steps, only if we go to meetings, use sponsorship, read the conference-approved literature. There's an old saying that comes to my mind as I'm sharing this reflection with you, and it's one of the oldest sayings in our rooms, and it is this: it works if you work it, so work it, you're worth it. Do you want sobriety in your lives? Then God has to be the center of that process. And the courage to say, I want sobriety, requires the surrender of no longer fighting against the truth, and requires the prayer of willingness, so that the defects of character which put us on the slippery slope back to active addiction can be removed. And so these are the promises that we hear about in the program. As we let go of old ways of approaching life and trust that God will reveal new ways, many of us begin to have a greater vision of what our life in recovery could be. It's the reality that letting go of the old and being open to the new is better than hanging on to the old. And we cannot come to that awareness and come to believe that without the grace of the higher power in our lives. Because left to our own devices, the ego always takes over and we choose poorly. The disease rears its ugly head and pulls us back down that slippery slope into relapse. And that's not acceptable. Nobody deserves that. Instead, we deserve the greater vision of what our life in recovery could be. And so when we pray and meditate on the 6th step, new insights about ourselves and our shortcomings will often come to us. Think about that for a second. What I'm saying is very simple and practical. We go into some time in silence and say, higher power, help me to understand what my shortcomings are, and help me to be more aware of them. And I'll say something about that in just a minute. And then help me to be willing to give them to you so that they can be removed from a regular part of my living. When we can get to that place in our spiritual lives, we are ready for change. And our attention turns directly to our higher power as the source of that energy and motivation for change. It doesn't come from our egos. It comes from our connection to our higher power, so that we ask in humility, God, an imperfect person, a broken person, Help me to be willing to let you remove my defects of character. Give me the strength and the perseverance and the energy to engage in service. Help me to listen to myself and to those who I meet in the rooms so that I can be, for them, a witness of sobriety. Help me, assist me, guide me, open my heart. Help me to be willing so that you can take action in my life, because you created me, because you called me into this time and place for a purpose, to love myself and to love those around me, and to share with those I have the privilege of meeting along the happy way of destiny my experience, my strength, and my hope. So sisters and brothers, when we can come to that place, then we can begin to understand what our character defects are. And let me make a short list here so that we have crystal clarity, because it is a simple program and it is a practical program. The most typical character defects that we struggle with in our recovery and in our human living are selfishness, me before anyone else; greed, more for me and less for you; blame, it's not my fault, I had nothing to do with this; self-pity, pour me, pour me, pour me a drink. It's gossip, working the other guy's program and not paying attention and taking responsibility for my life. It's perfectionism. If I can't get it perfectly right the first time, then I'll never get it right and I should not even try. It's being abusive, in which the dignity and the respect of the other person becomes violated because I can't control my anger, my resentment, and my desire to be powerful. It's manipulation, in which I enter into relationships thinking not about how we can be friends with each other, but what I can get from you and what I can take from you, and how I can do that maybe without you even realizing it until after you've been wounded. It's dishonesty, not speaking the truth about who I am, what my intentions are, and what my motives are. And it's gossip. I said gossip twice, because that can be one of the most destructive character defects, because it distracts us from our own here and now reality. It distracts us from knowing ourselves, and it takes the focus off the right place of the focus, which is me. And one of the great spiritual paradoxes in the 12-step recovery program is that the better I take care of myself, the more effective I will be in service to others. The more time I spend in prayer and meditation, the more I will understand the wounds that I carry and the wounds in the sisters and brothers that I'm privileged to meet in these rooms, and how to provide support and accompaniment to them as their recovery process unfolds. And the more that I take care of myself, and the more that I love myself, the more I want to share that with others around me. The more I want to engage in service, not for a hidden agenda, but simply for the sake of service, because it helps me to stay focused on my sobriety. The steps lead us in the right direction. And in step 6, that willingness, that courage, that surrender helps us to be selfless, to be generous, to share what we have with others without agendas, to have a stronger self-esteem, to be able to love and accept ourselves more, to be able to say good things about other people without feeling jealous or with a hidden agenda, to be flexible, to be supportive and protective of others, to be able to let go, especially in tense situations, and most of all, to be honest, and to be able to stay focused in our life of prayer. This is what we work for. And in the steps and in working the steps, this is what leads us to the place where we are entirely willing to have God remove all these defects of character. And so, sisters and brothers, as we conclude this 2-part reflection on the sixth step, I ask you, I implore you to think seriously about willingness, to ask God for the courage to change, to surrender to the truth of this disease being a great dis-ease in our lives, and to be willing to ask God to remove the defects of character so that our service in the 12th step can be authentic, can be clear, can be motivated by love for self and others, and not by hidden agendas. I wish you all great, good graces in your sober lives. God bless you all. Thank you.